Thank you very much. Is it on? Yeah. I mean, Sam already said everything I wanted to say, to be honest. So I just finished writing a book about a concept that I call network-centric statecraft. And this morning we heard quite a lot of discussion about networks, the empowerment of networks, exploitation of networks. And most of the time, when people speak about networks, at least in this context, they talk about technological networks, they talk about network-centric statecraft, warfare, which is about cyber, AI, and so on. What I'm talking about is really a complete change of how we look at the world. The problem is, for most people, especially in Europe, and I think that's a particular European continental problem, partially UK, but in Europe, we look at the world still through the lens of states, and still through the hierarchies of state, which is civil service, the military, and we look on conflicts within the boundaries of states. That's not necessarily how the Gulf states look at the world. And the fact being, obviously, that the Gulf states strategically are very different. They have adopted a lot of the bureaucracies that the West has brought to them, and have created some hybrid state where you have the hierarchy of state in the way that we have it here. But they also have these informal networks that run the country, that make them very agile, that allow for connectivity, that make politics extremely personalized. And these networks, in a network-centric world in which we live, are extremely powerful. And what I want to say is you have to imagine the world as a network of flows, nodes, and these nodes are not just governments. These nodes are companies, individuals. They can be, commodity traders, they could be logistics companies. They are all nodes in a transnational networked world. And the way you need to look at this and why this is important is what is important here are the flows that connect these nodes. These can be financial flows, they can be commercial flows, they can be flows of people, flows of commodities, there could be flows of currency, there could be flows of data. AI obviously feeds into that. And if we look at the world through flows and how you shape these flows, then network power in the 21st century is about weaponized interdependence. It's about how you extract influence from that interdependence. Ultimately, the way we teach strategy, or I teach strategy in the UK, is we're looking at strategy ultimately as the creation of power. Is how do you create, with all the means available to the nation, not the state, but the nation, how do you use all the different resources available to create leverage? And networks are an immensely powerful tool to do that. And the way that the Gulf states have done it is basically through orchestrating and connecting themselves to those international flows. More so, integrating themselves as indispensable hubs in these global flows. And that is no longer just, 20 years ago we would talk about the small states of the Gulf, right? We were the Qatar and the UAE as small states. They wanted to be relevant, which is a very, very arrogant Western way of looking at it and saying, oh, these small states, they want to be relevant. Cute. In reality, though, I mean, things have changed dramatically, as Camille was saying already. The relationship has completely shifted over the last 20 years. And if you look at the UAE in particular, I'd say the UAE is the most powerful country in the Middle East. And I would say they're more powerful even than Israel. And not because of their military power, but it's because of the power of connectivity. But then you look at Saudi, look at Qatar. The way that you measure their influence is not based on their army and the size of their military or the size of their bureaucracy. It's not just their bank accounts. Obviously, the bank accounts play an important role in this. But it's how they create and manipulate connectivity to create an advantage. So ultimately, what this is all about is making yourself indispensable. You're becoming a hub in a network. And as a hub in a network, you can dictate how the flows go. You can open the taps, you can close them. You have gatekeeping power. You have agenda setting power because you set the agenda. And we see that in the relationship between the Gulf countries and the European Union. It's the Gulf countries who set the agenda. We see this in the UK post-Brexit, the way we engage with the Gulf. It's the Gulf states who set the agenda. And the UAE in particular, being extremely assertive, they very much tell us what the agenda is, and we'll have to follow because we're on the receiving end of this. And so the book, it all started with an idea that's come out of the office of Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed, who was the National Security Advisor. So in the late 2000s, they did a study on networks and how powerful networks are. And we see this strategy unfolding. Ibtisam was talking about connectivity, how connectivity has been used to extract influence. And the interesting thing with the UAE is they are a hub in global financial networks and regional networks. They are a hub in commercial and trading and logistics networks. And that's not just the ports. It's not just Dubai Port World, which was one of the biggest logistics companies in the world, but it's also, cargo, air cargo. Any trade with Africa through the Middle East is run through the UAE. It's commodity trade. Dubai has become the gold hub of the world, and certainly the gold hub of the global south. So if you have gold, and most of the gold in Africa is connected to elites in Africa, if they want to get their gold to market, they can go to the UAE. They're a jurisdiction that have almost no checks and balances, and you can do it. And it ties the UAE to the elites of these countries. Obviously, information AI, UAE is leading on AI development, data centers, and they're integrating with Chinese companies, American companies, again, to make themselves indispensable. If you look forward, the information networks that are being built right now will be dominated in the global south by the UAE. And we're in Europe, we're not even thinking about it. We're entirely dependent on the US infrastructure and ecosystem. The UAE in particular, but also the Qataris and the Saudis are trying to diversify. They're buying a little bit from the Chinese, they're buying a little bit from the Americans. So this book really started with the UAE, and then I started to unpack and say, okay, let's go beyond just these economic and financial statecraft mechanisms, and let's look at Qatar. So Qatar as well is obviously in energy terms a superpower. In the trade of gas in particular, it's not just what they're producing in Qatar and exporting. Qatar has invested strategically in choke points in the United States, in Argentina, in Africa. So they dominate the global trade, the entire supply chain of LNG, which again, Europe is on the receiving end of. It's not like Europe has any sort of bargaining chip to play. Qatar, obviously, in mediation as well, they have injected themselves in these networks of non-state actors, from Hamas to the Taliban to different state actors. If you want to have access to some of these networks, you have to call the Qataris. And the same is true for the Emiratis. They're connected to all these networks in Sudan, in Yemen, and many of these networks are connected where individuals are connected through financial dependencies on these Gulf countries. And so what you basically have done is you've weaponized interdependence. Saudi Arabia as well, energy, obviously in energy markets, development is something that you mention as well. Syria will not be rebuilt without the Gulf. And Europe will be following, it will not set the terms. The agenda is set by the Gulf. The same is true for Gaza. Europe is following, it's not setting the agenda. And what France has done over the last couple of months in terms of setting the agenda with the two-state solution and Palestinian statehood was remarkable, but it was only possible because they had the backing of Saudi Arabia. Anyway, ultimately, I'm just going to finish now. It is about strategic autonomy, and network-centric statecraft has allowed the Gulf countries to emerge not just as middle powers, but achieve a level of strategic autonomy which is not just based on the military and defense domain.
Thank you so much, Andreas. That's fascinating optics on the region. My first question is going to be for you, actually, Andreas. So you mentioned, it was actually fascinating, connectivity leveraged as influence tools. You've mentioned the fact that probably the UAE is the most powerful, but also Qatar has developed a very indigenous, interesting strategy in terms of connectivity, as well as KSA, etc., etc. My question is, all of these three countries that are often presented as rivals or at least co-opetitors, that is to say a mix of competitors and collaborators, can they, I think the overarching question that I have for you is, can they afford to be divided, specifically in the context of 2025? Can they afford to be divided, and can they afford to be rivals in this run for connectivity and this run for leverage on the international stage?
No, rival is a strong word. They were rivals from 2017 to 2021. But I think the developments since Al-Ula, when the Gulf states reconciled, has been quite remarkable. For me, remarkable, because I thought there was no way that they would get back to a level of intimacy that they have achieved now. I mean, what was remarkable for me on the 10th of September was the entire elite and leadership of Abu Dhabi and Dubai came to Qatar the next day, shaking hands and pledging support to Qatar. That was remarkable in the context of the blockade of Qatar. But I think what we're also seeing is a realization that obviously together they have complementary networks. It is where these networks are not complementary but competitive, where there is still friction, obviously. But we're now at a state of negative integration, not vis-a-vis Iran, as the Americans always wanted it to be, but negative integration against Israel as the most destabilizing power in the region. And it's about stability and it's about development. These countries can only develop and they can only prosper with regional stability. So warfare and escalation is not in their interest. And here they're up against, and I shouldn't say it's not necessarily Israel, but it's Netanyahu's Israel, that is unpredictable, is unhinged, and is a country that, for the Gulf states at least, seems to have no boundaries. So in this kind of context, I think there's been a negative integration where they're willing to pool their networks. And that's particularly important in the context of Washington, because in the Trump administration, you have a president who works through networks as well. It's the informal statecraft in Washington right now that dominates Middle Eastern policy. And all of the Gulf countries, Qatar and UAE in particular, have integrated themselves intimately into these networks around Trump. And they're influencing policy and they're working together to kind of against pro-Israel networks. And I think that's a remarkable development considering where we were 5 years ago.